Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I begin by congratulating the Honourable Member for Brighton Pavilion on having A, secured this debate, and B, for having made such a terrific speech. Because, as she said, the forthcoming COP matters enormously for all the reasons that she set out. We need targets so we can measure progress. That's the great benefit of them. We need funding to help make that progress. We need every country that makes a commitment to have a plan back home to deliver it. We need progress to be measured. And above all, we need leadership. We need leadership internationally, domestically, in communities, and leadership by us as individuals. The decline in biodiversity and the loss of species across the world is well documented, but sadly not well known enough. Now, I should declare my interest, as one or two other members have done, as the water vole species champion, which is an extremely grand title, especially when it's held by someone who, despite his best efforts, has yet to see a water vole in the wild, although I did once hear the characteristic plop sound that a water vole, Ratty, who I know well from reading Wind in the Willows to my grandchildren, the sound they make when they come out of their mud tunnels in the riverbank and drop into the water. Now, perhaps it's very hard to see them for the very simple reason that since the end of the 1990s, a nationwide survey showed that water voles had disappeared from 90% of the sites where they were found a decade before. 90%. And there's been a further decline in the decade thereafter. Now, in the case of water voles, there is one particular problem, which is predation by mink, who need to be controlled. But what is really needed is improved water quality and to encourage farmers to restore and protect healthy waterways. In other words, places, rivers, where water voles can thrive. And at the heart of this problem, and colleagues have touched on this in their contributions, the thing we've got to address is that we as humankind have been making use of the Earth's gifts, those on the land and those beneath the seas that surround us, as if there was no consequence and no end to nature's bounty. That is what we've been doing, and the pace at which we've done that has accelerated enormously in the last century or so. And just as with the climate crisis, we know now that that is not true. There is a limit, and we have to start taking proper care because we rely on the natural world of biodiversity for our very existence, including our economic welfare. And we should applaud, actually, the work of Pavan Sukhdev, who I had the privilege to meet when I was the Environment Secretary, and Sir Partha Dasgupta, who have taught us about the economic value of biodiversity, if you wish to measure it in that way, in exactly the same way that Nick Stern told us about the cost of not dealing with dangerous climate change, which is up here, as opposed to the cost of dealing with it, which is down here, and said, you make the choice. Now, as we know, the natural world provides us with the very essentials of life: clean air and water, food and fuel. It regulates our climate, it helps to deal with pollution, it stems floodwaters, and it produces medicines. It is the very foundation of our economic and social well-being. And a few years ago, I had the honour and privilege to visit the World Agroforestry Centre in Nairobi, and there we went into a lab and there was a range of plants on a bench, and I went down and said, what's this, what's this, what's this? And one of them was a small Artemisia sapling, and the other, rather odd-looking bit of bark, apparently came from the Prunus africana tree. Now, I happen to know, because of my job, that I knew that Artemisia is essential in making combination anti-malarial drugs more effective, and I learned that Pygium, I don't know whether I've pronounced that correctly, from the bark of the Prunus africana tree, has properties that help to treat prostate cancer. So we stood there, and there was, we were discussing malaria, which is predominantly a disease of the poorer world, and prostate cancer, which has been a disease predominantly of the better off world, although that is beginning to change, but both of which are reliant on those two plants for their treatment. And just imagine if some clod-hopping human being thousands, millions of years ago had walked through the forest and decided to pull up to examine the only Artemisia sampling on the planet and the only Prunus africana sapling on the planet. Think what we would have lost. And that's why there is such a strong argument for looking after both what we have and which we know about, and about the plants that surround us, which we haven't yet discovered the properties of. Now, despite the gravity of the crisis in biodiversity, I think it is important that we try and address the task with optimism, because in the end, making ourselves so depressed about the scale of the challenge is not, in my experience, a great motivator for action, because we know we can make progress. Look at the creation of the national parks. That extraordinary bit of legislation of the post-war Labour government out of a time of great conflict, economic crisis, debt and so on, and politicians with the support right across the House legislating to preserve beauty for posterity. Look at the size and commitment of the wildlife trusts. Now, there are about 870,000 members. They look after 2,300 nature reserves, and they're providing some of the connections that my right honourable friend, who spoke so well a moment ago, was talking about, because you can look after bits, but it's the connection between them that will help us truly to restore nature, which is why towards the end of my time as the Environment Secretary, I asked Sir John Lawton to produce a report precisely on how those connections can better be made. Look at the marine conservation zones created thanks to the Marine and Coastal Access Act. Now, of course I will give way.
On this point of connectivity, I think it's very important. Is he aware of the agreement that is there between a number of Central American countries in order to create a wildlife corridor for the jaguar to survive, because it obviously has a huge range of travelling, and if it's cut off into certain isolated bits, it will simply die off?
Well, I would say to my right honourable friend, I wasn't aware of that. I am now, and what a great idea for countries to be able to work together in that way. Now, when we were taking Marine and Coastal Access Bill through Parliament, I was really quite surprised to discover how little we appeared to know about what was on the seabed surrounding these islands. And thanks to some very intrepid divers, some of whom I met, they went down and took photographs. And when you looked at them, if you showed them to me or to anyone else and said, well, where was that picture taken? Most people would say, is that the Great Barrier Reef? No, it was under the murky waters of the North Sea. And one of the things about nature that we know is that although we have been destroying it at a rate of knots, if you give it the chance, it can recover with astonishing speed. And the North Sea was originally covered abundantly in oyster beds, coarse peat banks and rock deposited by the glaciers, and it was home to a rich community of marine species. A lot of that was sadly destroyed by bottom trawl fisheries over the past century, and now it's a relatively poor community of species. And a word on bottom trawling, because I have to say I think it is an incredibly destructive practice, but it's one that is unseen because it takes place beneath the waves. And to make an analogy, which is slightly absurd, imagine if, say, to collect apples, someone decided to drag a net across the countryside, taking with it all the hedges and the tree saplings and the bird nests and the trees on which the apples hang, just for the purpose of collecting the apples in the process. Of course, people would be outraged and appalled, but that is what we've been doing at the surface of the seabed for a long time, and no one sees it happening. So bearing witness to what is going on, the right honourable gentleman who spoke earlier and who's not in his place anymore, when he talked about the deforestation of the Amazon, the thing about technology is, with satellites, you can see how the forest, the rainforest, is reducing over time. And it's really important that we use all of those means to bear witness to what is taking place, to motivate change. And you can find the recovery of nature in some quite surprising places. Research has shown that wind farms, a lot of debate about wind farms' impact on birds, but they act in effect as artificial reefs. and can host a very wide range of marine species once nature has had a chance to recover. And the final point I want to make, Madam Deputy Speaker, is about the contribution that nature makes to our health and our well-being. Of course I will give way.
Right, for giving way, and I'm sorry I couldn't be here for the beginning of the debate, but on the marine parks, isn't the concern that although there's been a designation of many of these marine protected areas, they're really just paper parks, and things like bottom trawling are still being allowed to continue? But does he also share my concerns that there's now a move towards deep sea mining, which could be hugely environmentally damaging?
Yes, I do. Now, there was cross-party support in the House of Commons for the Marine and Coastal Access Act and the creation of marine protected zones. We have basically a planning framework that we've had on the land for a long time, but we didn't have one for the sea at all. And now it confronts us with a choice about what we permit, and being able to understand what the consequences are of what's happening beneath the waves is important, and we now have the means to do something about it. But we can't just say, well, we've got the designation, job's done, we'll move on to something else, because it isn't sufficient at all. Now, my wife and I were discussing yesterday what I might talk about in this contribution, and she said, well, apart from telling me you must mention the water voles, which I have now duly done, and I hope that she has noticed, she said, tell them about our oak trees. Now, for the past 30 years or so, we've been planting oak trees from seed, ash and silver birch trees on a nature reserve. It's a very, very grand title for 8 acres of former farmland in Essex that my mother set aside, where nature has been left to do its work. The tallest oak tree now is probably about 20-25 feet, and the trees that we planted, the trees that nature has brought, have brought with them, over the years, cuckoos and owls and adders and foxes and mountjack deer, the odd badger, white campion, and loads of brambles that I attempt to go and do battle with whenever I can. But every time I walk into this piece of land, I feel the same sense of anticipation. What's changed, what's grown, what's different. And why do we feel like this? Because nature is part of our very souls. It is about who we are and where we come from. And just think of how we encounter it, looking out of the window of a train at the countryside as it rushes by, the first crocus of spring, encountering the wonders, the glories of the Yorkshire Dales, a view of Ditchling Beacon or of Scarfell Pike from Great Moss, or hearing the buzz of a bee at the height of summer, and we don't hear that as much as we used to, or seeing moths. I think of my lifetime, and I think when moths were really common in the summer, when did I last see one? You know that extraordinary experiment that was done where people were asked to put a bit of sticky plastic on their number plates and then drive around, and then they counted how many insects were caught. And comparing it with what people had done before, they were able to show there's been this catastrophic decline. And of course I'll give way. Return.
Yes, apologies for having popped out briefly. Family call needed. The thing that struck me recently, so last summer I went to the far north of Scotland, and the further north we got, the more insects hit the windscreen. And given the fact that arable farming is more in the south of the country than in the north, it did seem to me pretty clear evidence that actually there is a link between the disappearance of insects and pesticides, which is one of the reasons I was so attracted by the regenerative farming model.
Well, I agree completely with the right honourable gentleman. Now, there are one or two insects in the north of Scotland, midges in particular, that can cause a certain amount of distress. But the glory of the Scottish countryside and the mountains, and who would not feel a sense of awe and wonder as we contemplate the astonishing biodiversity and landscape that our small islands reveal unto us? Of course I'll give way.
I'd like to commend the honourable gentleman for his planting that he's done in his 8 acres of land and how he has seen the changes. I'm very fortunate, Madam Vice Speaker, to live in a farm where we've had the opportunity to directly plant trees. We've planted some 3,500 trees, retained the hedgerows, put in 2 ponds, We see bees and moths regularly, and lots of wildlife as well. But government has committed themselves to replanting across the whole of the United Kingdom. Does the Right Honourable Gentleman feel that there should be more of a commitment to more tree planting to ensure that we can become literally the lungs of the world?
I agree with that completely, and there should be no limit to the number of trees that we can plant, and we can each play our part if we have the opportunity. MPs, because of the nature of our job, probably get invited to plant the odd tree in our constituencies. And the point that the Right Honourable Gentleman for Islington North made earlier about front gardens is really, really important. One of the things we did after the floods of 2007 was to change the planning rules. You cannot hard pave over your front garden anymore unless you use permeable paving, because, of course, if you pave tarmac and concrete over all the land in a town and city and huge quantities of rainfall out of the sky, where do you think the water's going to go? The fact is it's going to flood into people's homes, and that makes us realise the interconnection between the choices we make as human beings and the consequence of not paying sufficient attention to nature. And to conclude, I would argue that to be disconnected from nature is to be disconnected from the earth itself. And so it's not just self-preservation which should urge us to confront the threat of climate change and biodiversity loss, because the two are absolutely connected. It should also be our love for the soil from which we all came and to which one day we will all return, but not just yet.